Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
It was cold and people were huddled together. A young girl who was standing on the platform, timidly, looked around. She didn't like being so nervous. All these months, as she had planned the event, she had been calm, but now for some reason she was terribly nervous. Sometimes she felt like her heart was shaking. "Excuse me, may I see your ID?" the police officer said as she approached the platform exit. Yes, sorry," she said my words with her head. "That's okay. Everyone is a little unassembled this early," said the man with a smile, returning her documents. Kelly stepped out onto the platform. It was a little warmer here than in Moscow. The wind that gave away everything inside the station seemed to be less harsh. Kelly walked over to a bench and sat down so that it would blow less on her. People were walking around like a penguin, flopping from one foot to the other. Some hugged themselves with both arms, others leaned in close. It was cold. A dark blue bus with white stripes showed up on the horizon. Soon it was pulling onto the platform and people were approaching the entrance. Again, the checking of documents, tickets. That was it. It was okay to get on. As soon as Kelly climbed the steps, sat down in her seat, she immediately felt that she was gradually beginning to warm up to her father. All she wanted was for the bus to move, and for the people filling it to breathe. Everyone came in, rubbing their palms or rubbing their forearms. No one had expected that spring could be so pro-Moscow at night. But there were those who managed to put on warm jackets and now watched the irresponsible passengers with triumphant smiles. When the bus filled up, the driver got behind the wheel. Kelly put her headphones in her ears. No one sat down next to her. The bus was half empty. Apparently, all those people waiting on the platform. They were going to take a completely different route. Smooth music started playing. Kelly switched to rock. Right now, she wanted a distraction to make the nervousness stop. A woman came in with a folder, asking a question. Where she took off her headphones, the woman repeated it. "So who's going to the settlement? Put your hands up." "Yeah, I see," she said and made a few marks. "A. Fedorov, not so good. There's someone else who goes out to the small villages." I said Kelly, and then I said the name of the village. "Okay, guys, sleep. Don't worry, I'll tell the driver. He'll stop if there's anything to wake you up." "Good roads," she said, smiling, and got out. Kelly put the headphones back in her ears. The bus moved off a little while later, pretty soon gray, unattractive. The station with the broken clock was gone. The city's high-rise buildings appeared. After a few more minutes, the private sector began, and in another 3 o'clock, the city disappeared. Long fields, forests, strips of land black from the fertile soil, and over it all stretched a gray sky that had yet to turn blue before dawn. Kelly closed her eyes and tried to sleep. Right now, the sooner she fell asleep, the better. After a few minutes, she fell into a restless sleep with constant awakenings. Still, it was better than staring at the road for long hours. A large, busy village spread out on the plain. Somewhere in the distance could be seen the tops of a forest. The river, which ran along the entire forested area unheard, ran between the rocks. From early morning and even before dawn, the voices of people were heard. Apparently, it was the gathering of those who were working in the city. The old woman woke up with the first rays of the sun. She still couldn't get used to this house that her son had given her relatively recently. The village where Betty had lived all her life had gradually died out. It was dangerous to stay there. Her son had moved Betty to a new place, bought her a nice new house, and now the old woman woke up and could hardly remember where she was. She had a sheet by her bedside with everything signed on it. Her illness was draining her of her last strength. Betty, with her will in her fist, continued to live, or at least tried to keep her activities stable. "Good morning, Betty," said the neighbor with a smile. A young woman was already standing near the bushes, watering the roses. The sun was slowly rising over the houses, whimsically illuminating the roofs in warm hues. "Good morning, but tonight is the night." "Wow," said the elderly woman. "Oh, don't tell me. We didn't expect it ourselves. We even put the heater on. It's spring already. It's like summer days are just around the corner. And I was afraid that the roses would freeze," said the neighbor. The older woman nodded. She smiled a little and then concentrated. looked around at the young trees that her son had recently planted. Apparently it was just cold, but it hadn't gotten to frost. She smiled because she was relieved that the trouble had passed. "Why are you here so early?" "Retirement, it's beautiful. And you don't have a vegetable garden as such. Everything's in greenhouses. It's time to get some sleep." The neighbor continued with a smile. "Oh, in the other world you laughed," said Betty. She frantically tried to remember the name of the neighbor, but cannot sleep in her old age. "My son is coming today. We need to prepare food, set the table. And it's a habit when you get up at dawn for decades. No old age can help you forget it." The neighbor nodded understandingly. The man came out, said something to her, and then disappeared back into the house. Betty went into the greenhouse, checked everything, and then returned to the house. She had to get ready for her son's arrival. She opened the book. The instruction sheet came across again. The elderly woman felt so helpless that tears just started to accumulate. She used to be so active, so cheerful, but now she sometimes forgot how to turn on the stove or where it was. There were days when Betty would wake up in her bedroom with fear, realizing she wasn't in her own home. Lately, she was thinking more and more about asking her son to go to a nursing home. Soon she wouldn't even remember her own kindred person by sight. Then what was the point of living among people? It was better to be near the medical staff, who would always remember her, help her in case of anything. A motor whirred outside. Betty glanced in the mirror, smiled at herself, and then stepped out onto the porch. Holding on to the railing, the older woman walked down the path toward the low gate. The man who stood by the car was smiling. She looked closely at his face, but couldn't remember. "Mom, I'm your son." "Your son. Look at the pictures together," he said, carefully holding out the picture to her. "Of course, Sonny. I'm not forgetting you," said Betty. But she had forgotten him. And every time the elderly woman thought about it, and she got scared. She was losing the last shreds of her memory, remembering with even more difficulty. "What's up? How are you doing? I see you cleaned up the yard. I told you I'd come and clean it up myself. You shouldn't have done that. You should take care of your heart and joints." With care in his voice, Michael said, "Oh, son Michael, I didn't do anything. I took some eggs to the neighbor. I asked him to clean up a few bundles of greens. He took it all to me. But look how beautiful it is," said the old woman. She spread her hands. Betty would never admit to her son that she didn't like this house and yard. She would rather stay in that abandoned village than try to accept her loneliness here. She wished frantically that some of her family would stay by her side. But that was no longer possible. And Betty's greatest fear was that one day she would not be able to remember her own son, would not let him on her doorstep, would die alone. They entered the house, where everything was fine, even though the disease had taken away not only her memory, but her strength as well. Betty tried to keep the house clean. She was afraid of waking up one day to see that she was living as if in a stable. Her son was glad that his mother continued to be herself, but he tried not to notice how lonely she was here, despite how many people were around. "Mom, I came to talk to you." "Why don't I hire a nurse for you?" he asked. "Why do I need a stranger here?" Betty asked in astonishment. "No, Sonny, I don't need strangers here. It's a pity you have a lot of work. You should come here more often. I miss you, Michael. Oh, I miss you so much," she said with her head down. "Mom, I have to go to another country for a few months. A complicated, long business trip. And I wanted to tell you something about you. Anyway, as soon as I come from the business trip, I'll make you happy," said Michael. You could literally see on his face that he was getting off the subject, but Betty tried not to notice it. After all, she had a grown son who was entitled to his secrets. She forgot his name again. The older woman looked at the man, and the man smiled. "Son, how long are you traveling for?" she asked. "A couple months. And you're sure you can manage on your own? If you realize you can't handle it, call me right away. I'll leave you a note by the phone so you'll remember to call me anytime, and I'll send someone right away." "Okay," he said with a smile. Michael would not tell his mother that he was leaving also because he was terribly tired of her. Catastrophically tired of watching his mother fade before his eyes. He couldn't see her struggling to remember his face, and struggling even harder to remember his name. He wondered if she remembered that he wasn't an only child. Michael shook his head negatively as if he was having an internal dialogue. "Big girl. Can handle it, sure," the older woman said. And then she laughed. "Mom, do you really, if anything, call me? I hope I can get through this faster. I've got my career in full swing. You can't stop now." "No offense," Michael said. "Oh, son, don't worry. I was young once too. I wanted to live. It's awful. Don't worry about me, live and be happy. I'll be fine. You'll see," she said. The old woman smiled, patted her son on the shoulder. The name never came to her mind. Betty sadly noticed that she was getting worse. But she wouldn't tell her son about it, so he wouldn't worry, so he wouldn't cancel his plans for her. A few hours later, they were already standing in the yard. Betty was holding a bowl of pie she had made for her son. He took them to hug them goodbye, saying some amazing words to her. Michael got into the automobile. His mother, who was standing near the fence, waved him off. He would drive away, and perhaps in an hour the elderly woman would not remember him. Michael felt a prick of conscience, some unpleasant inner agitation. He had a strong feeling that he was abandoning his mother in a difficult situation. But he had been trying for so many years to get her out, to help her, that he had almost no strength left. There was a struggle going on inside Michael. On the one hand, he wanted to give his mother to a nursing home, where she would be under constant supervision. On the other hand, at the mere thought he felt guilty, as if he were abandoning her to her fate, depriving her of the last bit of normal life. The village itself was already behind him. He drove towards the airport, replayed in his head the situations that had happened recently, and became afraid of the thought that he would arrive one day, and he would be met by a completely alien look of the woman who was actually his mother. Michael left the car at home, gave the keys to a friend. He took a cab to the airport, where his girlfriend was already waiting for him. When he left, the world would slow down for a while, and all worries would cease to have power over him. Right now, he needed a distraction. His mother wasn't going anywhere. The bus pulled up to a large village. When it stopped, Kelly was sound asleep. She jumped up when someone touched her shoulder lightly. The girl got off the bus in a friendly manner, waving to the passengers who were watching her tiredly, glad apparently that her trip had come to an end, and they still had a long drag to get to their destination. Kelly took a deep breath, crouched down a few times, because her legs stiffened horribly. The old man who sat at the bus stop looked at her carefully. All the locals roughly knew each other, and any outsiders were suspicious. "Excuse me, could you tell me where Betty lives around here?" Kelly asked. The old man looked up thoughtfully, with a nodding lip. Apparently he was trying to remember, but only shook his head negatively. His eyes brightened in a flash. "And how is it that right down the street, right there, the house will be blue, you can't miss it? Right from that house. To the right is a white openwork fence, and behind it is a light-colored two-story house. That's where she lives. And who are you?" asked the old man. "Daughter, my brother, and I have a difficult relationship. You know, family. He moved my mother. He didn't even tell me. So I've been looking for her. How did you know she was getting worse? So I thought I'd come down. Live with her," Kelly said, with a smile. "You're so smart. It's really hard for your mom to forget things on the go. Sometimes she can't even remember how to get home from the store. It's good that she came to live, not just to visit for a couple hours, like your brother. Women have a kinder heart than we men," the old man said. Kelly smiled. She followed the route, but she was a little confused. She seemed to find the blue house too. All the fences turned out to be similar to each other, and the houses themselves were typical. It was immediately noticeable that the village was modern and old, where the shabby huts could not be called houses. The girl, to suggest something, asked a short, full-figured, lovely woman, "I'm still very pretty. I was told to turn from here, but I'm confused. I'm the daughter. I can't find her." "So unfamiliar," Kelly said. "Oh, there's her house," the woman said with a smile, pointing to the house with her palm. "Thank you so much," Kelly said with a smile. As she walked up to the fence, she began to pull an envelope out of her bag. The envelope fit a little, but she tried to straighten it out. "Can I help you?" Betty asked when she saw the girl at the gate. The old woman was embarrassed every time someone came to see her. Maybe it was a relative. Maybe it was an old friend she couldn't remember. "Mom, it's me." "Look," she held out a picture of Betty, Michael, and Kelly all together. "God, I got here so late. I didn't even know you'd gotten worse." Michael wouldn't tell me anything. He kept saying everything was fine. "Mommy, I'm so sorry." The old woman stared at her with an absent look. Apparently, she was trying to remember. And then her eyes filled with tears. "Oh, my daughter, I forgot you." With bitterness in her voice, said Betty. Neighbors came out of their houses, watching the story. Some even shed a tear, imagining how old age might affect each of them. "Mommy, don't worry. I came to live with you. Everything will be fine. Don't worry. Now we'll help together. I'll get started. You can't get rid of me now," said Kelly and laughed. As soon as the old woman heard that she would no longer live alone, she shook inside. She cried even more, unable to hold back her emotions. Betty felt some treacherous feeling inside that tormented her, as if she was forcing herself to remember her own daughter. They entered the neighbor's house and gradually dispersed and went about their business. Betty sat at the table and Kelly clapped at the stove. She was frying pancakes and deftly flipping them with one hand. The girl clearly looked happy. Betty looked at her, but struggled to remember any interactions. But could she rely on her own memory now? The older woman looked sadly at her daughter. "And Michael, when was the last time, Mom?" "By God, they should have put devils on him. Why does he come so rarely?" Kelly asked, exasperated. Betty ran her eyes over the pictures. She couldn't remember who Michael was. And the son. The older woman remarked aloud. "So he's away on a business trip. As far as I don't know, I can't remember it, but he left me a note by the phone. Can you look at it?" "All right, later, Mom, later. In the meantime, let's eat with you." "Do you have any jam?" Kelly asked. "Yeah, in the basement. Get your favorite cherry," said Betty. She had no idea. Why did she suddenly remember cherry? The old woman smiled. Already she knew and enjoyed the fact that she was no longer sitting here alone. No more quiet evenings in an empty house. No more trying to remember the loved ones who had left her here. "Where will you be?" "Oh yes," Betty said, remembering that the guest room was always empty. "Mom, don't worry." "Okay, that's it, we'll live together. After all, you can't remember everything in the world and keep it in your head. Really, if you forget something, even my name, if you forget it, just tell me, I'll remind you, and I won't be ashamed. It's not your fault." Kelly persisted. They chatted merrily. Kelly reminisced about her childhood. Betty only recorded those memories as her own. It was as if her daughter was helping her to rebuild her past life. For the first time in a long time, the older woman fell asleep without tears. She knew she would wake up tomorrow. She would read the leaf and then go about her business as usual. But her soul was warmed by the thought that her daughter was with her now. She wouldn't be gone in a day. In a week she would be there for her. Betty fell asleep with a warm sense of security, with love in her soul. Kelly woke up, listening to her surroundings. Everything around her seemed to be asleep. The girl slowly got out of bed, walked over to the older woman's bedroom, but she was asleep. Kelly went downstairs, took a pair of scissors, threw over the counter, and cut the telephone wire. She took off the note that was on the phone there and put it in her pocket. The girl walked all over the first floor, taking the albums, hiding them. Taking a few pictures out of the frames, she also hid them and put them in her pocket. Kelly did her best to make sure that nothing else in this house reminded her of Michael. The only thing that mattered now was to make Betty feel safe. When all the work was done, Kelly went out onto the porch. She lit a cigarette, leaning back. The tall wooden post that supported the roof of the porch. Kelly looked at the clock. It would soon be dawn. Tomorrow she would be a model daughter again. In the meantime, it was okay to just stand there, smoke. Don't worry about the woman's reaction. Sooner or later, Betty would find out she was smoking anyway. But for now, you had to keep up the good work. The girl put out her cigarette, went up to the bedroom, and dozed off again. The next time she woke up, there was the pleasant aroma of apple pillows coming from somewhere downstairs. As she went downstairs, rubbing her eyes, Betty looked at the girl carefully, then nodded as if to show that she remembered her. Come on, daughter, sit down. We had breakfast together. Will you tell me why you came to your mother? And don't lie. Young girls don't just go back to the village, Betty said. Contrary to Kelly's doubts, the old woman didn't notice anything, neither the missing photos, nor the missing albums, nor even the fact that the usual notes were gone. Kelly laid out new notes in her own handwriting. She also put a photo on the table next to her mother's bed. And in that photo, she was already alone. Betty's mom divorced her, Kelly said. I know. You're going to say it's a shame, that I should have kept the family together. But I'm tired. I'm exhausted. Oh, come on, it's not a shame. I'm not the same person I used to be. I'm sorry, my daughter, if I said any nasty things to you. I don't remember now, Betty said. What's so terrible? I'm sick of his drinking. Remember how Dad used to drink? I promised you till the grave that I'd never choose a man like that. What did Mom end up doing? She ended up marrying a drunk? I had no idea it was that bad. He drank, beat me, kept asking me to have a baby. And I ran away. I filed for divorce as soon as I got the divorce papers. Ran to you, she said. Kelly deliberately didn't mention Michael. She wanted to see if her mother would remember for a moment that Kelly had a brother who could help her. But the older woman only shook her head negatively. Sympathizing with her daughter, she gave her advice, repeating that Kelly had done the right thing. Daughter, you're wasting your life here with me. You really want to stay? Asked the old woman. I want to spend time with my mom. There's no life to lose. It's great. You smell so good here. It's got its own atmosphere. Don't worry, we'll be fine, Kelly said. The next day, they had a pretty normal schedule. The days went by. Gradually, they built up their own schedule. The old woman was so used to not living alone that even her memories did not include tear-filled evenings. They had dinner together, cooked, looked after the household, where she cleverly reminded her mother, discreetly prompting her what her name was, who she was, and what kind of life the old woman had led before the bony fingers of disease touched her. Quietly, Betty wept, but already she was partly crying. That her daughter lived with her, and that in this life together the old woman did not even remember her ailment. One day they were gardening. Kelly was pruning shrubs, and the older woman was giving her advice on what to do next. The neighbor who was having her bouquet cut came to them. Here, Betty cut you some, she said with a smile. Thank you very much. We'll put you a point. We'll be happy, the older woman said. Michael, when is he coming? Asked the neighbor, where she splashed out abruptly, looked in their direction. She hadn't foreseen that the neighbors might disturb her perfect picture. Now Betty stood and looked intently at the neighbor. Michael who? Betty wondered. Your son, said the neighbor. I don't have any son. The older woman said insistently and thanked her again for the flowers. Mommy, you go inside and I'll talk to Adriana, Kelly said. And you could hear the trembling in her voice. The old woman nodded a third time, thanking her for the flowers, and left. Adriana looked at Kelly carefully, then at the closed door. She couldn't figure out what was going on. They were having a big fight. I've tried to make it up to her, but it just makes it worse for the mother. She's having a heart attack. Michael wants to put her in a nursing home. She's screaming that he wants to get rid of her, that she doesn't have a son. Please don't remind her of that, because her heart's not made of iron, Kelly said thoughtfully. What a bunch of men. But they just want the responsibility off their backs. Okay, I hear you. You're good to stay with your mom. Who knows what's going to happen to her if she's out here all alone? Did you talk to the doctor? Michael says he gave your mother a tiny sentence. Heaps saying she won't make it through the winter, the neighbor said to muffle her own voice. Yeah, I saw the papers. That's actually why I came to stay. I don't want her to be alone for 3 months, Kelly said. An old woman watched the conversation from the window. What son? What made the neighbor think she had a son? The old woman looked around, but the pictures showed her with either strangers or her daughter. Betty remembered for some reason that she had lived here recently. The neighbor must have just gotten confused. When Kelly entered the house, she had a wary look on her face. Betty looked at her daughter and immediately smiled. Oh, Mom, don't worry, it's just a mix-up. You're new here and everyone knows each other. Don't worry. We just talked it over with her. She remembered that she mistook you for the aunt who lived here before. Kelly literally came up with it on the fly. The old woman was perfectly happy with that answer. But her health began to fail before her eyes. After a couple of days, Betty fell ill, and then she refused to eat or drink at all. Adriana. I woke up to a loud banging on the door. She was trying to wipe her eyes. Went out into the hallway and swung the door open. Saw a frightened Kelly. The girl had huge eyes, pale skin, and an easy-to-read mask of fright. Aunt Adriana, call an ambulance. The mother's cell phone's not working for some reason. My cell phone's out of range. It's bad and she's suffocating. Heart palpitations, Kelly blurted out. Adriana woke up and in a second she was up from her seat, running to the phone. Then the older woman had already called an ambulance. Kelly was out of sight. Already the ambulance pulled up to the house. The doctor came in. He knew the patient's diagnosis. He had to reacquaint himself with her. Despite the fact that it was the 10th time she had been reacquainted, she flatly refused to go, Kelly said. Shaking her head negatively, the doctor had already relieved the patient's condition. Now he went down to the first floor with his daughter. Such a disease. And age too. It's not surprising. You can go and get the medicine. I'll leave you the prescription. But you don't get your hopes up, the doctor said. Kelly handed him the papers and he read them carefully, but shook his head no. You can't even expect her to make it through the winter. If she even lived for a month. Thanks for that, as they say. It's a tough case. Honestly, with these abnormalities, she should have been in the ground a long time ago. Thank God she's been with you this long, the doctor said. Kelly walked out onto the porch with him and then escorted him to the ambulance. The doctor looked worried. I'm afraid it's my fault. She had a big fight with someone. And I reminded her of that person. What if her heart fluttered because of it? Kelly asked. The doctor looked her in the eye, and she somehow calmed down when she looked back. Despite what had happened, the man remained calm, composed. Don't worry with such an affliction. It's not your fault. Just stay with her a little longer. And change your SIM card so you can call her immediately, the doctor said. Kelly nodded. The ambulance drove away, leaving her alone. The girl stared after the departing car, hugging herself with both arms. She hadn't counted on the elderly woman getting sick so soon. She had an entirely different plan. Kelly returned to her mother's bed, already sound asleep after the medicine. The girl leaned her palm against her forehead. Her skin was clammy and cold from sweat. Kelly sat by the bed for several hours. She didn't notice herself dozing off in the chair. When she woke up, Betty was trying to get out of bed. Mommy's doctor said you need to lie down, Kelly said. Who are you? Oh my God, my daughter, I'm sorry, said the older woman. It was evident with what anguish she remembered her daughter, and now she was back on the bed, where she helped to change the bedclothes, put the mother down again, changed her into a clean shirt. The older woman had absolutely no strength. Call Ethan. We need to talk, she said. Kelly nodded. She went downstairs. She found Ethan's number on the note. When she called him and outlined the situation, the man promised to be there within a few hours. Not quite noon, a dark, low new car pulled up outside the house. Out of it stepped an elderly, stately man who clearly did not want to admit his age. Well, Betty, it's good of you to call, Ethan said. Mom, you asked me to call him, said you had business with him. Remember? Kelly asked insistently. She turned to the man. I'm sorry, she was sick tonight. An ambulance was called. The man nodded. Daughter, I need you to pick up some papers down there in the closet. I wrote a letter the other day, but I can't get up anymore, Betty said with sadness in her voice. Kelly brought in the papers. They had a dry conversation. Betty's entire will have been drawn up in advance, apparently a few days before she'd gotten worse. The old woman had described all her assets and savings to her daughter's only child. Daughter, what's her name? Asked the man. Kathy said the girl who had previously introduced herself as Kelly. Betty nodded. She was having trouble remembering what had happened half an hour ago, and certainly couldn't remember her daughter's name. Kathy realized that her mother would never remember it in just a couple of hours, so as soon as Ethan left, she would be Kelly again. So as not to scare the neighbors or confuse them, Ethan went downstairs with Kelly. The girl nodded at everything he said. He was giving her warnings. Now they had already reached the car. A déjà vu formed in the girl's mind. Not long ago, she was standing next to an ambulance. Now this notary. I think it's time you took care of the funeral arrangements. It's not cheap these days. And you know, it takes time. Your mother doesn't seem to have time. I'm sorry. I've been in this business a long time. But sorry every time, he said. It's strange that she disinherited her son. She wanted revenge. Apparently, he wanted to put her in a nursing home. You know, older people are very vindictive, especially if the people closest to them want to leave them alone or dump them in some place where no one will want them, Kelly said. Ethan nodded, said goodbye to her, then got into the car. Kelly stood for a few minutes, then did all the chores in the yard. She cleaned up the grass that had been mowed yesterday, checked the greenhouses. Except that the shrubs they'd planted the other day suddenly started to wither. It had been a few days. Kelly woke up in the morning and for the first time in a long time did not feel any sounds. Whereas before she had awakened to the aroma of food, after the worsening of her illness she could hear mumbling. The elderly woman was reading, a little audibly out loud. To herself, she was very poor at assimilating information. Now in this lying position, she had only one joy left. Books. Kelly showered, changed her clothes, and entered Betty's bedroom. The woman was still asleep. Mom, it's late to wake up. I must have turned off the alarm clock. Let's get some medicine, Kelly said. But when she got to her mother, she was stunned. She wasn't breathing. Kelly sobbed. She screamed, and apparently through the open window, the neighbor heard everything. Adriana came running to their rescue. And when she saw the whole scene, her heart sank. She took Kelly out of the room, took her downstairs, and made her wash up. You be quiet. Come on, everybody already knew she was gonna die soon. What are you getting so excited about? That's the way you act before you have a heart attack, the woman said. Kelly gradually began to calm down. It was hard to accept the fact that she was going to live here for 6 months, and ended up staying only a month and a half, maybe even a little less. You're good for coming, right? Now imagine if she'd been all alone, dying. Or worse, couldn't even call an ambulance that day. Think about how happy she was these last weeks, that she didn't spend them alone. To hell with her son. He'd left her and moved away. The neighbor read, trying to be supportive of Kelly. She only nodded. Slowly, she came to her senses. She had to pull herself together pretty quickly, because all the things had to be taken care of in a short period of time. Kelly knew where the money was. She counted it for a rainy day, called a special service, talked everything over, and signed the papers. The date for the funeral was set. Everything else would be done without her involvement. Kelly decided not to have a wake in the classic sense of the word. Her mother hardly remembered anyone. Therefore, there were few people here who socialized with her. The girl gathered baskets of food, distributed them among the neighbors, and at the same time those who came several times to check on the old woman during these days. But even though there was no wake, a decent number of people had gathered for the funeral. They all stood slumped in their heads, watching the coffin being lowered. After a couple hours, there was no one left but Kelly. She was still standing by the cross, looking at the small picture of the elderly woman where she was smiling. Kelly went back into the house, began to pack her things. Someone had come to pick her up. Adriana, who was chatting with the girl, went to the fence most of all to exchange a few phrases. But seeing how busy Kelly was, she went inside. Are you leaving? Adriana asked. I thought you were going to stay here for good, or are you just taking the pain of losing your mother? I'm selling. I inherited the house, and I'm selling it, she said. I know it must be hard to be in a place where your mother was all alone. But you know, I wouldn't sell a house if I were you. Just move somewhere else. Then fix it up. It's such a great place, she said with a smile. Where did she suddenly find out? Looked at Adriana. And why did this woman suddenly think she could give her any advice? The girl was still standing, as if trying to find the words, but there was no strength. I told you I'm leaving. So I'll leave, Kelly said calmly. Not half an hour later, she loaded her suitcases into the car, closed the house, and then got into the car and drove away. The neighbors were whispering. Apparently, they had their own gossip about it. Adriana. I looked longingly at the house where the friendly old lady used to live, and now who knows who is going to move in. She took one last look at the car lurking in the distance, and then went off to her room. Kelly sat in the passenger seat, thinking back to the funeral and how it had gone too fast, too painful for her. She really had been preparing herself for a longer journey, but fate had decided otherwise. I thought you'd be back later. Don't get me wrong. It's hard to accept death. But on the other hand, you won't have to live in this village anymore. Fresh air, green grass, it's all great. But when you're used to city life with all the comforts of home, I don't know. I feel like the countryside is becoming some kind of prison without communication, the woman behind the wheel said. Kelly was silent. Maybe she didn't want to discuss anything, or maybe she just wanted to be quiet now. After all, everything had gone relatively well, but she knew that there was more to it than that. As soon as Michael returned, the situation would take a more dangerous turn, and it would be a good idea to finish everything before Michael showed up and possibly ruined her life. Aren't you afraid of the consequences? The voice came again and pulled Kathy out of her thoughts. Now it was hard for her to even think of herself in her familiar name, as if she had not just pretended to be Kelly during this time, but had been her. I know it's going to be hard and probably a lot worse than I realize, but I've already committed to it. There's no turning back, and there's no reason to, she said. But the important thing is to make sure everything goes smoothly, especially since he missed you so much. Yesterday, he even cried that he hadn't seen you for a long time, said the woman behind the wheel. I do everything for him. You know that very well. I hope everything goes well. Then I don't know, I'll probably be thanking all the possible gods on my knees, Kathy said. Everything's gonna be okay. I'm sure that fate must come down on you at some point. After all, it's long overdue, the woman said. The car had long since left the neighborhood where it had been in the village. Both women changed the topic of conversation. Now they were talking about something mundane. Neither of them recalled the funeral or Betty. Not all the machinations Kathy had dared to engage in, taking advantage of the situation. Kathy remembered her son's face, imagined how all the torment would end in one fell swoop. If she were offered the chance to go through it all again, to save her son, she would do it. Michael was sitting on the airplane with his fiancée, and she was holding his hand, but very weakly. The man knew that she had dozed off almost immediately after takeoff, but he hadn't been able to sleep. He was literally being eaten alive by guilt. He'd abandoned his mother, lied to her about the business trip, just so he could spend time alone with his fiancée. He planned to be there in a couple months to introduce his mother to his lover. Now the only thing he had to do was go to the cemetery. And who was in charge of the funeral then? He didn't want to think about it. He'd gotten a call to let him know. A condolence call, and that was it. How much longer? Christina asked. She opened her eyes a little. Her face showed signs of fatigue. So many hours of flying. Anyone would be tired here. Christina stood up in her seat, adjusted her seatbelt, which she would never unbuckle. For the entire flight, she pulled a crumpled lollipop out of her purse, popped it in her mouth to stop the nausea. Landing in 200, he said, and she nodded. Didn't feel like discussing anything right now. She leaned back in her chair, looked at her future husband. It did not escape Christina's eyes that Michael looked depressed. She was aware of the situation, but she didn't understand why he should be so upset about it. The man knew his mother was seriously ill. He knew it could happen in his absence, but somehow he still felt guilty. You need to calm down. You can't spend the rest of your life blaming yourself, she asked me. I left her, you don't understand. She was out there dying alone while I was grilling you on the beach. I knew it was dangerous to leave her. I feel like a traitor, Michael said. Christina shrugged. She pulled the blindfold over her eyes, which had just been on her forehead the whole time. Michael was not surprised by her detachment. Christina had always been less emotional than he was. He loved her, was willing to marry anything to make her happy. This whole situation had significantly undermined their relationship. Michael began to snap at his fiancée, barely restrained emotions. But even he understood perfectly well that in him speaks guilt. It's not your fault, Michael. Your mother was gravely ill. She died. It happens. Especially since you knew the doctor's prognosis was overly optimistic. She didn't even remember you before she died. There's no point in worrying, Christina said. Michael got up, walked along the cabin of the plane, went into the restroom. He stood there for about 10 minutes to calm down and only came out when the knocking started. Michael felt defeated. No support, not even from his fiancée. For the first time, Christina's coldness had hurt him so much. How could he not think about his mother's death? How could he not think about leaving her alone while he sunbathed and enjoyed his vacation? When he returned, Christina didn't say a word to him. Apparently, she was dozing off again, or maybe she was pretending not to talk to him about anything. After landing, everything was standard. Michael picked up the suitcase. They left for the car that was already waiting for them. After a couple hours or so, they were at the apartment. The first thing the girl did was head to the shower to clean herself up. When she came out almost an hour later, she looked clearly better than she had on the airplane. The man followed her example. When he got out of the shower, Christina was arranging food from containers. Only at dinner time. Both of them realized how hungry they were. Christina never ate on an airplane, and certainly not before the flight. She gets carsick a lot. Such were her methods of caution. Michael didn't eat because he was very anxious. It was impossible to get even a handful of food down. Listen, let's go to the cemetery tomorrow. You apologize to your mother and calm down. I don't want to see your tired and upset face all the time. I understand you're upset. But I also want to have a husband by my side, not a personally sad boy, Christina said. He nodded. He didn't argue with her. Maybe Christina was right. It was time to pull himself out of this state. Early the next morning, the man was already behind the wheel. Christina immediately declined, citing that she had jet lag. After how long they had been at the airport before their flight, how long the flight had been delayed, she was understandable. Michael had expected her to travel with him to support him, but she stayed home. As the man drove up to the village, he passed the mother's house. He felt like a traitor, felt some inner emptiness. All the way the man was tormented by a constant sense of guilt, which only grew. Here before him grew unnaturally huge wrought iron gates of the cemetery. They were very old. The rusty gate would probably never close again. The old man, the cemetery caretaker, glanced quickly at Michael, then turned his attention back to the card game he was busy playing. His opponent didn't even look at the newcomer. Michael pulled out a bouquet of flowers, entered the gate. His mother bought her own place in the cemetery, about 6 months before she died, so he knew where to go. Here at last showed a mound of earth, a beautiful carved cross, and a small photograph. There were plenty of fresh flowers. Even though Mother had been dead for over a month. Forgive me if you can, Michael said quietly. He couldn't say another word. A lump rose in his throat, preventing him from crying or saying anything. Somewhere inside, a painful sense of worthlessness was growing. When Michael looked up, he saw a familiar silhouette. He recognized Adriana almost immediately as his mother's roommate. He wanted to close himself off, to fall through the ground and run away. He wanted to do anything to avoid being seen. He didn't want to hear what a disgusting person he was for leaving his mother all alone with such a serious illness. Adriana had already seen him, changed course, headed straight for him. Michael realized that an unpleasant conversation could not be avoided. He went outside the fence to wait for his mother's neighbor. You couldn't tell from her face that Adriana was angry. Her face was rather just sad. "Hello, Michael," she said. Michael nodded. He realized that she was trying to find the words. Of course, anyone would be trying to find words after all that had happened. Adriana looked at him with an unhappy, frustrated look. He only smiled crookedly. The man didn't know what was worth saying now. "I guess I should be saying that you did good. You bought your mother a house. But honestly, I blame you. You left her alone and ran off to work," Adriana said, in an unhappy tone. Michael suddenly thought that her hatred would have been even stronger if she'd found out that he'd gone away not for work, but just to vacation with his future wife. He simply lowered his head so as not to diffuse the conflict. "She didn't remember anyone here. Looked at me like a new gate every time. and you left her alone. At least Kelly's here. Thanks for that, Adriana said. Kelly's here? Michael asked. She nodded. The man looked worried. Apparently, he was trying to remember who Kelly was and who might have come to see his mother. Adriana paid no attention to the fact that he looked a little lost. The poor girl had fiddled with her so much. Your mother had gotten so sick in a few days before she died that she went blind. Well, Kelly didn't ask anyone for help. Cooked and cleaned and bathed her. Everything she did to make the old lady comfortable. If it wasn't for her, you'd be a mother. Couldn't even call an ambulance for herself. Did you even know she cut her own phone cord? Adriana asked. Michael looked at his mother's former roommate in amazement. She didn't even look at him. All this time, Adriana was just staring at the grave of her former neighbor. She shook her head negatively. I'm going to have a baby. I wish I hadn't done what you did. How scary is it when you can't remember anything? And you were left alone. Gee, Michael expects karma from his own children, Adriana said. And when did Kelly arrive? Asked Michael, letting the threats pass his ears. The same day you left. You should at least ask her. You probably didn't even leave her any money. It's not for nothing that your mother said she has no son with sons like that. I'd rather not know my father. Adriana decided not to listen to any answers. She turned around and walked towards the familiar grave where she was originally headed. Michael was completely confused, standing there looking at the grave. Not many people her mother remembered from her past. After all, she had plenty of girlfriends. It was odd that his sister's name was Kelly, but it was unlikely that she would have been at his mother's house, much less cared for her. Michael stood for a few more minutes. He apologized to his mother one last time and then walked to the car. He replayed over and over in his head everything that had been said until he was completely confused by the story. One thing was clear, the mother didn't seem to have died alone. It took a long time for the man to leave. It was either guilt or some inner turmoil that prevented him from moving. There was also a strange sense of unspoken. As soon as Michael started the car, the phone rang. Michael picked up the phone and heard the familiar voice of an old friend. Listen, Michael, are you in town? Asked the man, and there was anxiety in his voice. Nearby has already happened. What? Michael was worried. I need you to come up to the office. These things are not discussed over the phone. You know that. It's obviously not a legal thing. Can you come down today? The man asked. I'll be there in an hour and a half, if there's no traffic, Michael said. Now the situation got even weirder. First, some Kelly, then a call from a friend. Everything was connected. Michael turned on the radio so he wouldn't have to think about anything. He hoped the music, the announcers' voices would help distract him. But instead, he kept going over in his head what had happened, and how could it be explained. Michael felt in his gut that the situation was just beginning to gain momentum. The man pulled up outside the law office. He left the car and went up to the right floor. Sebastian shook his hand firmly and in a matter of minutes took him to his office. He took out copies of the papers and handed them to Michael. We can only hope for your honesty. These are copies of your mother's will. Are you aware that she left you with nothing? He asked. Sebastian looked troubled. Michael, who had not yet grasped the situation, ran his eyes over the papers, trying to figure things out for himself. This can't be happening. I don't understand. Where's the name? Who gets everything then? Michael asked. That's the interesting part. I don't know who did it and how they did it. But here's the last copy. All the apartment accounts. The house in the village went to Kathy, Sebastian muttered, holding out another sheet. Michael first blushed, then turned pale. It was obvious that he was completely confused, hardly aware of what was going on. The information was coming at him in an avalanche. He looked up at Sebastian. Sebastian, I have no idea who Kathy is. It's the first time I've ever heard that last name. I'll hold on. There's something fishy going on here. First, my mother's roommate tells me that Kelly was helping her. This is Kathy all over again, said Michael. Sebastian went through the paperwork again, too. But there was no mention of a Kelly, not even close. It was all jumbled up into one endless story. Sebastian took all the papers back and put them in a folder. But after thinking for a couple minutes, he shoved them into his bag. He couldn't let himself get caught red-handed. He'd already broken a lot of laws while he was sneaking copies through the courts. We just digitized the office. Our whole system's changed. I saw your mother's initials, last name, when I saw there was nothing left for you. I realized there was something fishy going on. I thought I'd make copies. If you tell anyone, believe me, not only will I be fired, but I won't even be able to get a job afterwards, Sebastian said in a guilty voice. He realized that his friend might go to the police, but he hoped he was being reasonable. Michael only nodded, staring at one point. Don't worry, I won't go anywhere. I'll have to do some digging. I don't like this whole story at all, Michael muttered. Michael didn't want to back down. He kept everything he just heard and seen in his head. He dialed the phone number, erasing it. The man sat there, thinking for a few minutes. He dialed the right phone number after all. Pretty soon, the young woman who answered on the other end of the phone promised to call an old lady. Michael was answered by an old friend of his mother's, whom she must have long since forgotten. Hello, Michael. I'm sorry for your loss. It's a great loss to lose your mommy, said the woman, shaking her head negatively. Christina, I have a few questions for you. Can you tell me if Kelly was a friend of yours? I was told that my mother was helped by a Kelly before she died. And now I can't find her to thank her. You see, I went on a business trip to another country. I didn't even know what was going on here, Michael said. The elderly woman thought for a while when her voice broke again. All the man's hopes were dashed. We didn't have any Kelly. Only your sister, as I recall. But that was it. I was surprised at the time. Such a rare name for a girl, the old woman said. Does Kathy or does the name Kathy mean anything to you? Michael insisted. He really wanted to know what was going on after all. It was scary to just be in the dark like this, realizing that his mother had been tricked. Kathy, repeated the older woman. She stopped talking. She was staring at the wall, but Michael couldn't see her. He could only hear her heavy breathing. She was about his mother's age. No wonder her health was failing. Cross my heart, Michael. I don't remember any Kathy. You go to the village itself, ask the neighbors. What are you waiting for? They must know by now. They're all out in the open. It's you city folk who shut yourselves off from each other. In the country, everything's on display. All right, Michael. Tired. I guess I'll go, she said. Michael said goodbye to the old woman. He arrived home, but he still couldn't sleep. Until the morning, the man replayed in his head everything that had happened. He didn't really explain anything to his wife, and he didn't want to worry her unnecessarily. What was the use? Christina would not support him anyway, and there was no sense in having a conversation for nothing. Early in the morning, Michael was already sitting in the car and writing down everything he needed to find out. He needed to figure out who Kathy was. Also, who was Kelly, who showed up, helped his mother, then disappeared. What if his mother had been under the control of some black realtors all along? It was scary to think that once again he hadn't kept her safe. Michael started the car, drove to the village, trying to distract himself with another program on the radio. The car crossed the village road, and finally the typical village houses came into view. Michael, who had already gone over the questions dozens of times in his head, was ready to talk. The man who lived directly across the street from Michael's mother had said something great. Now the cabin looked vital and empty. Even looking at it was eerie. More recently, laughter could be heard from there. Lively conversations, and now the black windows looked eerily across the street. Hello, Uncle. What kind of maiden came to see her mother when she had been bad the last few days? Asked Michael, deciding not to start from afar. So she came, I think, the same day you left. Although, you know, Michael, I probably don't remember most of it myself. I'm on medication. But my memory's suffering. Nice girl. I remember helping your mother, laughing all the time, saying they had a full family now, said the man, shrugging his shoulders. What's going on over there? Asked Lisa, leaving the house. The uncle's wife looked worried. She stepped closer. The man outlined the situation to her. Yes, a nice girl kind. Hair like that, you know, shoulder length. Eyes dark, almost black, skin a little swarthy, pretty, you can tell. I wondered how such a pretty girl got to the village, said Lisa with her hands. She looks like her, Michael asked, realizing that the answer would be no. In the picture, he was next to another dark-haired girl. Oh no, it was different. What's the matter? Did you lose it? You and your sisters are brothers, always losing touch, running away. And then there's no end in sight. You should go to Adriana. They've been talking well. They probably call each other back, said Lisa. Michael nodded and almost immediately turned abruptly and went to the neighboring house. He knocked, and a few minutes later Adriana came out. She was wrapped in a warm robe over Mask's face. Michael frowned. Come in, Michael, do not be afraid. The tooth is being treated. So I put the mask on. The smell of the medicine is creepy. I'm freezing because my teeth hurt. Come in, don't be afraid, she said, pointing to the gazebo. Yeah, I'll just be a couple minutes. I don't have time to sit around much, said Michael. I'm sorry I snapped at you then, said Adriana. Apologizing tone. Oh, come on. I understand perfectly. I blame myself. Can you tell me who Kelly was that looked like? Michael held out the same picture again. No, I don't know this girl at all. Don't you know where to find your own sister? Even though she said you haven't spoken to her in 7 years. You can't do that, Michael. You've got a mother now. No, you've got to stick together. You're on opposite sides of the barricade, Adriana said in that tone of voice. I haven't spoken to my sister in 4 years, but now we call every day. I'm afraid we'll lose each other. Michael looked very carefully at Adriana's face. He apparently couldn't put 2 and 2 together, and his head was filled with white noise. He tried to concentrate on the conversation, but it wasn't working. I had her phone number, but she wasn't answering. I guess she decided to change things up. She packed up after the funeral and left the same day. The house is still standing. Sometimes some people come by, so she must have put it up for sale, Adriana said. Michael thanked her warmly for the phone number and then went back to the car. He turned the car around, leaving dust behind him. Michael tried to call the phone number several times along the way, but nothing worked. Nervousness was starting to push through the upper limits. Just a little more and he would start to get angry. Michael entered the apartment, but did not answer his wife's questions, but went straight to the shower. He stood under the icy jets, already completely out of his mind. Michael, can you explain to me what is going on? Christina insistently spoke, obviously dissatisfied with the fact that she had to literally beg. The circumstances of his dissatisfaction. Let me come to my senses, said Michael, rather rudely. She fell behind him because she knew it was best not to piss him off in that state. She came back to him an hour later when Michael's face had gone from angry to lost. He told her everything that had happened, and that your sister couldn't come to see your mother. It's good that your mother was with someone close to you when she died. You can finally get rid of the guilt. Really? Christina asked. Yes, Christina. The only problem is that my sister Kelly died 10 years ago, Michael summarized. No one would recognize her from the photo. It couldn't have been Kelly. Besides, there was nothing left of her in the coffin either. He threw the mug and it shattered. Christina stood there like a thunderclap, stunned, still trying to comprehend what she'd heard. Some black realtors must have taken advantage of the fact that my mother didn't remember anything, so they made a farce of it. Oh God, I don't know. What if she was sick? She was a month and a half before she died. She thought she had her daughter with her. She didn't even remember that her daughter was long dead. She didn't even remember that it took her so long to die. It just doesn't make sense, Michael said. He threw his head back, bumping painfully against the wall. But that didn't bother him now. He sat there, thinking about what had happened and trying to figure out how to handle the situation. So he'd have to go to the police. Then we'll find out who got everything. Maybe they just rewrote the house. Your mother has several apartments as far as I remember, and all old people have an account where they put money for years, Christina said with a shrug. Apparently she was trying to find something to hold on to. He looked at her with a completely hopeless look. He had thought he would have to settle inheritance issues, sell the apartments, take care of the house. And now it turned out that in all probability he would get nothing at all. And what can the police do? It's a certified document that says in black and white that everything goes to Kathy. So you don't know any of Kathy's family? Christina asked. I remember Kathy, but not Kathy. And what does she care about my mother? How many years has it been? I don't know. We should probably wait for her on the day of the reading of the will, Michael said. They talked for another half hour or so before they changed the subject. Michael had pretty much deflated by now, calmed down, could talk normally. It was hard, but he tried to keep his cool. For the first time in a long time, he was able to sleep. But in the morning, an interesting idea came into his head. Michael, having secured the support of an old acquaintance, decided to talk to him about what had happened, to find out in advance whether it was worth going to the police. David was waiting for him at the station for an informal conversation. Even though Michael had done nothing wrong, for some reason, being in the police station made him uncomfortable, as if he were here against his will. Look, David, what if Michael started to talk, but a man interrupted him? No, Michael, since you're here, just tell it like it is. No assumptions, David said with a wry grin. The thick scar that crossed his nose was frightening. It marred the once handsome face of Michael's former classmate. Okay, it's just a stupid situation. Anyway, Maria's mother had an illness. She was so sick, she couldn't remember anything after an hour. I'd leave notes all over the house. I always came with a picture of us so she'd have a chance to recognize me. Anyway, I went away on a business trip, came back 2 months later. And my mother was gone, Michael said. And he paused. David momentarily had the smile blown off his face. He handed water to his former classmate and now listened much more attentively. In the will, it is all normal, signed, certified. That is not a forgery. It says that everything goes to another person. And I don't know this person. Can I do anything? Michael asked. In theory, you can write a report. An investigation will begin, said David, shrugging his shoulders. But in practice, Michael clarified. And in practice, there's absolutely nothing you can do. Michael, if everything is certified, signed, no one will approve anything for you. Am I right to understand that you have not been with your mother for the last months? Even if they ask the neighbors, they will all confirm that they bequeathed to someone else that you were not around. In these matters, everything is very sharp. Almost nothing can be proved, said David. Michael leaned back in his chair and looked somewhere to the side. His gaze was hard. When he looked at David again, he was focused. He left the office and came back about 10 minutes later. It's not gonna work. Michael, there's no felony. You just didn't get the inheritance. Whoever it was did a very clean job. There was something you could have done if you'd gotten some sort of disability, as if to confirm that your mother couldn't live on her own, David said, gently sidestepping the urgency of the situation. Are you saying I left my mother in a dire situation? Asked Michael grudgingly. The only thing I'm saying is that you have no chance of proving anything. If you want to file a report, call me. But I won't promise anything, said David. Michael left the office in an even more shattered state than he had been before. It was hard to believe that all this would go unpunished. At home, Christina tried to cheer him up, to calm him down. But Michael was in a state where no one could help him. Everything inside of him was boiling all the time. Now and then, Michael went to the balcony, stood there, waiting for him to calm down. He did not want to yell at his future wife, and certainly did not want to ruin relations with her. Because of his temper, he could spend hours in his office, listening to his own thoughts flow. Somewhere in the back of his mind, Michael knew exactly who Kathy was, but the last name didn't add up, and that she would come all the way out here? For what? For home? I don't think it was worth it. She couldn't have calculated in advance that she would arrive and leave before Michael returned. The man didn't just feel cheated. He felt as if he'd been broken into. On the day of the announcement of the will, Michael was already standing outside an hour before the appointed time. He couldn't even sit in the car. Frost, a light rain. There was a real storm on his mind. The man who was to announce and explain everything entered the room. Assistant Michael followed him. I've already called the other side. I understand you'll be alone tonight. I don't know why you're here. I don't know why your mother changed her will and appointed a different trustee for the funeral. 2 apartments in the center of the counting house. Everything went to Kathy. "I don't know what you want to know or get from me," in a tired voice, the older man said. "I want to know who Kathy is," Michael said insistently. "Look, I've got a dozen people like you. You come, you resent me, you argue with me. But I can't do anything about it, you know. All I can do is announce a will that's already been prepared. If you want to deal with her, look for her. She'll probably show up at the house soon to put it up for sale. That's the way it's usually done." The man spoke again in a tired voice, showing no emotion at all. Michael did not even speak to him. He jumped out, but immediately looked at the secretary and stopped. "Can I get the phone number mentioned in the will?" he asked. The girl shook her head negatively. Michael went outside. He got into the car and immediately grabbed the vibrating cell phone. "Michael, it's Aunt Adriana over there. You might have time to talk to her," Adriana said. "Thank you so much." "You can't imagine how much you're helping me out," Michael said. He had probably never driven so fast to his mother's village before. Michael just flew down the highway, not even afraid of getting a ticket. And now all he wanted was to see the face of the girl or woman who had gotten it all. When the car finally stopped outside the house, when he burst into the house, he was stunned. Standing before him was the very Kathy he had suspected just a few days ago. He couldn't believe it was her. Slimmed down, all grown up. She had a different, grown-up face. Michael thought he was going to scare the girl, but he didn't. Kathy didn't even seem surprised that he was here. "So it's you. Since when are you Kathy?" he asked. "If you remembered anything other than getting up my skirt, you'd know that's my real last name," he said. She was looking at him like a wildcat. It was as if she were ready to pounce on him at any possible second. "I don't understand," Michael said. But he didn't have time to finish. "Of course you do, Michael. How can you understand? Have you forgotten how you took me against my will? Forget how you played the relationship game. As long as I don't report you." "I remember everything, Michael," Kathy screamed. She took a few steps back, and Michael backed away too. He opened his mouth in shock, not knowing what to say for himself. He had grown up, matured, and tried not to remember the situation. Or what? "Michael? Don't you remember when I had a baby with you? Or did you forget the baby was born?" Kathy continued to scream in pain. Now the puzzle in Michael's head was coming together. One by one, he went through the memories in his head. He simultaneously hated himself and at the same time did not understand why she had decided to do such an immoral act. "I didn't do anything wrong. I followed you and realized you didn't care about your mother at all. I thought she only had a house. I had no idea about the apartments or the bank account. I didn't do it all for me. I did it all for him. I'll sell everything, buy him tickets, pay for his surgery and full rehab. My son will be healthy," Kathy said. "I'd say our son, but you don't care about him." The man, who was absorbing every word, looked around stupidly. It was as if he was looking for support in the empty house. Only now he noticed that there was almost nothing left that reminded him of his mother. "Weren't you ashamed to pretend to be my dead sister?" Michael asked. "Your mother didn't care. Whether I was her real daughter or not. I cared about her. I was willing to be with her for years, even though I knew about the diagnosis. By the time you came back from vacation, she wouldn't even remember you, wouldn't let you in. And I would have been with her until the end. I didn't ask her to rewrite anything. I was just hoping for a deed of gift on the house," Kathy said. Her voice got a little quieter. Apparently her confidence had faded. Michael raised his hands conciliatorily, as if to show that he was not going to attack her. But Kathy was still holding the long cane-shaped umbrella tightly in her hands. Was she gripping the handle so hard that her knuckles shared? That's not fair. Kathy is my mother, after all. It was all supposed to go to me, he said. And now it's going to a child you don't want. Remember when I told you about my son's diagnosis? Did you tell me you didn't want a handicapped child? It's easy for you to have a healthy baby. I can keep this one. Yes, what I did was completely immoral. But my child will have a life. And I'm willing to go to jail for that, Kathy said. Michael did not know how to justify what he had said in the past. Kathy tried to get around him, but he blocked her exit. She looked as if she was looking for something else to defend herself with. He wanted more explanations from her, something to appeal to. There's nothing you can do, Michael. No court will help you. Every neighbor here will speak in my favor. Maybe I'm not his own daughter. And that before she died, your mom wasn't alone. She was with someone she thought was her own daughter. You should have seen how happy she was here every day," said Kathy. "I'm sure you'll think about it, or I'll go through the courts," said Michael. "You'll persist in taking money from your own son." "Wow, that's interesting. And in court, I'm a fiduciary," said Kathy. She shoved him with her shoulder and sprinted out into the street. Michael wouldn't dare make a scandal in the street. Too much he depended on public opinion. The man stepped out onto the porch and looked around, as if afraid to see the neighbors. "You'll learn a lesson from life. Don't forget, every mouse will be hung by its tail," said Michael. "And I don't care if my baby lives." "Michael, the baby you left behind," said Kathy. She got in the car and wanted to pull forward, but he jumped out in seconds right in front of the car. She pushed him lightly with her bumper and then hit the brake. He came closer, but the girl blocked the door. "Kathy, you tricked her. You tricked me with the law. You think you're gonna get away with it. You're wrong if you think you can get away with this," he shouted. But Kathy backed up. Michael, who had rolled onto the car, fell forward and dropped his knees into the dusty road. Kathy turned the car around and then just drove off, leaving him all alone. Michael was still in complete shock and prostration. He was piecing together what had happened in his head and could not justify Kathy, himself, or the behavior of the neighbors who suddenly believed in the existence of his daughter, even though he himself had moved his mother here a short time ago. No one knew that his sister had died long ago. The man got into the car, came to his head to the steering wheel, then looked at the house, near which there was now a sign that read "For Sale." He drove home slowly, barely breaking the speed limit, the allowable threshold. Michael entered the apartment, plopped down on the bed with his clothes on. No explanations or stories. Christina was up to her neck in work. When she was free, Michael was already able to get up and take a shower. But there was no energy to eat. She set the small coffee table in the living room. It was only after that he was able to tell her everything. Christina was shocked that he had a child, and even more shocked that he had abandoned him to his fate. This was the man she was going to marry. "I accused her of having a baby, of running away sick. I lied to her about going on a business trip to earn money for the baby's surgery." Michael was adamant about not calling the baby his son. He must be about 3 years old now. Christina looked at her future husband with all eyes digesting the information and not understanding how he could not have told her about it earlier. "Don't get me wrong. It's not all that simple. I really do realize how wild it looks from the outside," but he started to speak. However, Christina interrupted him. "Leave everything as it is and establish a relationship with the child. After all, you are his father. Consider that God has saved you a kind of forgiveness from above for your Turkish act," she coined. Christina pictured with horror how Kathy had once been left alone with a sick child and a noodle from the man she loved. She imagined how the young girl had fought the system, suffered to get any allowance for the baby. Her throat constricted at the thought that all this time Michael had just been living like nothing had happened. "Do you realize how much money there is out there?" he asked. "What kind of money is there, Michael?" "A little house and 2 tiny apartments in the center. God helped the baby to have enough for the operation." "You're still thinking about money after all this?" "You have no idea how disappointed I am in you," Christina said. That night she packed up, left the apartment, and never returned. They were only able to reconcile a few weeks later, when Christina had already experienced the situation internally. Michael really decided to leave things as they were, but he never wanted to communicate with the child. He didn't want to know that he had a disabled child. Didn't want to suffer watching the baby's life destroyed. He chickened out, to put it simply. Their relationship with Christina changed dramatically. The woman was afraid that when she gave birth and the baby was unwell, and Michael was out of the picture, no, he convinced her that things would be very different. But as they say, statistics don't lie. Christina got in touch, found Kathy, and talked to her about everything that had happened. It turned out that the money from the sale of the apartment and the house was just enough for the surgery, the rehab, and a little vacation she had planned for a year from now, when everything would be behind her. What she said. Will she file for alimony? Michael asked. When Christina's conversation ended, Christina looked with pity at the man who now caused her only disgust. And how could she have loved him? It was sickening to think of letting him go to her, of accepting his offer. His son was about to undergo the heaviest surgery in another country, a long rehabilitation. All he cared about was whether he'd have alimony. The surgery was a success. The kid recovered very quickly. Quality rehabilitation helped him gradually return to normal life. By the age of 4, the little boy already looked like a quite healthy child. Of course, by that time, Kathy managed to earn money, but already on his small business. So they had enough for a vacation. She could not be happy that she got such a chance in life. Michael and Christina separated because the woman could not look at her failed husband with other eyes after the situation. Michael has found a new partner and has already made sure that she does not know anything about his past.